I don't know, maybe a couple feet off the ground, and that when the tank hits it, when the hull of the tank hits it, that's what triggers the EFP, the explosive, and the EFP to form. Explosively formed projectiles are used a lot in um, anti-tank munitions, in anti-tank weapons, and in landmines. It's basically the same technology, in this case, just employed using a scatterable mine. I posted this one first because in the Russian telegram world and the soldiers of Russia seem to be very frightened of this landmine. I can understand why. Any of these penetrator landmines, like this one, generally result in a catastrophic kill of the tank. A blast mine, where it simply has explosive, does not create a penetrator, will often only create a mobility kill on a heavily armored vehicle, such as a main battle tank or an IFV. For example, we saw that the Bradleys that were part of that unsuccessful breach attempt a couple of weeks ago, they're able to be recovered, and road wheels and tracks and so on are able to be repaired. The next mine that you see is a fragmentation anti-personnel mine. This is called the Mon 90. It looks very much like the United States Claymore. It is designed with the same principle in mind. It is a fragmentation mine against personnel. Fragmentation mines are not anti-vehicle. They will shred tires, but they will not penetrate armor. They are designed against personnel targets, and they're similar. They work similar to a hand grenade in the fact that there's an explosive charge in the middle. It creates fragmentation, whether it's part of the hull of the container itself, or whether it's BBs or other kinds of shrapnel inside. That's what this one has. Is it has a sleeve of BBs on the front side, so the curved side that we see, and there's an explosive charge behind it. This can be triggered by detonation, by command detonation, so somebody can actually push a button on a wire and to set it off. It can also be triggered by tripwire, so you can put a fuse in it and then run a tripwire to the side so that when the soldier walks across it, then the landmine explodes. And that's very similar to the next one. There are a lot of these. We're seeing a lot of these, actually, the OZM 72s, which is the next one. The third one, it looks kind of like a aluminum tin can with a little stick on the top of it. The tin can is buried into the ground. The top of it is usually not covered, so it's just buried around the sides into the ground, but not actually covered. And that little stick on the top is the fuse. You attach a tripwire to that. You run that tripwire across. And what this is this is the classic bouncing fragmentation, the bouncing Betty. When the tripwire is fired, there is a kicker charge underneath. It shoots the mine up into the ground, up out of the ground, approximately eye level height. And then there's a second charge, which has a fragmentation sleeve around it, so shrapnel BBs that go out in 300 or go out in all directions. These are particularly nasty mines. They're particularly deadly, depending on, of course, how close you are to them. Tripwire landmines like these, if the Mon 90, for example, or the OZM 72, if you do encounter tripwires, the most common method for getting rid of them is to use a hook on a string or on a rope. Throw the hook out like a grappling hook, throw that out, and then pull the string in until the tripwire is pulled and it detonates the landmine. You do that at a safe distance or behind cover, but that's typically the way to take out tripwire activated landmines like this one. Then we get into other ones that we're seeing a lot, which are anti-personnel blast mines. So these do not have fragmentation. They do not shoot up into the air, or they do not have a sleeve of BBs or other kinds of shrapnel that is blown out. It is simply an explosion. Call them toe poppers or whatever. These are things that will certainly remove your leg from the knee down, which of course is life-threatening. and these are particularly difficult to find. They're buried. They take usually very little pressure on a rubber or plastic pressure plate to explode. Now, unlike any mines you may have seen in the movies and so on, there's no time between stepping on one of these and it going off. There's no two clicks. Like if you move, you're going to die. You step on it, and it goes off. These are used quite often to protect different walkways. They can be used to protect anti-tank mines. And these are also very difficult in the case that when you're looking for landmines, you use a mine probe, which is basically a fiberglass or plastic rod that's about maybe a foot long or 20 centimeters long to actually look for these. And you have to be very careful when using a mine probe. You push it into the ground to actually detect where the edges of the mine are so that you can uncover the mine to try to remove it. These little anti-personnel blast mines are particularly challenging for that because it can be very easy to accidentally set off the mine with the mine probe. Of course, you're right there in front of it. That's not good. So those are common, and there are several different anti-personnel blast mines that are used. These are not scatterable, so none of the ones I've shown here are scatterable. Only the German AT-2 so far is distributed from a rocket or from artillery. Now we get into a scatterable mine system, the Russian Palm-3. The Russian Palm-3, as I mentioned, that's the next one. Anytime you see legs or anytime you see a parachute or a ribbon or something like that, that means that this mine is going to be dispensed. So it's going to be shot out of an artillery shell, or it's going to be shot out of a dispensing canister. Can be these dispensing canisters can be loaded onto a truck, and the mine's fired out of them. But then, of course, you need these legs to stand the mine up correctly, and in this case, it also has a little parachute so that it falls correctly. The Palm-3 is a bounding fragmentation mine, very similar to the OZM-72. It shoots out little tripwires. Those tripwires, when they are disturbed, then activate the mine, and the mine is then shot into the air and creates fragmentation. These are probably the most difficult mines to remove from the battlefield. There is no render safe with this. And even in this case, because of the way it is, not using a grappling hook with a rope is not always the best method in this way. We've actually heard stories of soldiers primarily using shotgun slugs to try to disarm or deactivate this mine. There is no render safe for this, but you can do enough physical damage to it with shotgun slugs that it cannot go off. And then I'm just going to close out with two other ones, two fairly common ones that we see a lot. Of course, there's the TM62, which is now the general purpose explosive in Ukraine by both forces. They use them not only as anti-vehicle mines, but also in terms of all other demolition jobs. You'll see a lot of people using TM62s to blow bridges, create road craters, etc. This mine is a pressure-activated mine with a large fuse plate on top. That's the red part. The fuse can be removed from the mine, at which point it kind of just looks like a big green donut. It is only blast, so the tank has to physically run over this mine. It does not have any kind of tilt rod. It does not have an electromagnetic fuse. The tank, the wheel or the track has to actually run over this pressure plate for it to detonate. One other thing on this is, unlike a lot of other mines that are newer, this one does not have a built-in anti-disturbance mechanism or anti-handling mechanism. This is a very, very simple mine, and if the fuse is removed, it's generally safe to pick it up and move it, as long as you've checked for potentially like a grenade underneath it, for example, any kind of anti-lift device underneath it. But that's the most common. And the last one, just to show you the range of landmine capabilities. So this is the M75. This is the anti-vehicle landmine that is fired from the RAMS system that the United States has provided. And this is kind of the basic design of all U.S. scatterable mine systems for anti-vehicle. It looks basically like a wheel of cheese. Now, what this mine has is this mine is a penetrator mine, just like the German AT2 at the beginning. So that top of that cylinder is actually creates an explosively formed projectile. So it is designed to go off under the center of the tank and to shoot a molten metal slug through the bottom of the tank with very high kinetic energy. And this mine doesn't matter which way it lands, up or down. It has an EFP on one side and an EFP on the other. So if we turn this mine over and it lands on the ground like that, it's just as effective. The fuse mechanism for this is electromagnetic. So it's a magnetic fuse. And so it doesn't have to make any contact with the vehicle. Essentially, the magnet fuse senses when a giant 30-ton piece of metal rolls over the top of it, and that's when it detonates. These mines also have things like a self-destruct mechanism and so on in the U.S. scatterable mine arsenal. So we've basically looked at all kinds of different mines today. Just wanted to run through some of the different types. So of course you've got anti-vehicle, you've got anti-personnel. Within anti-personnel, you generally have fragmentation, and like a Claymore or Mon 90, you have bounding fragmentation, like the OZM 72, and then you have blast mines like the PMN4. These are all fairly common. These are all widely used in Ukraine. And then when we look at also in anti-personnel, we'll have scatterable mine systems. They generally follow the same principles, whether they're bounding fragmentations or blast or whatever. It's just that their emplacement technique is different. They're dropped or scattered. And then within anti-vehicle mines, you'll have blast mines like the classic TM62, or you will have penetrator landmines such as the M75 and the German AT2. This is just a sampling of all of the different types of landmines. These images today are from CAT UXO. You can check out their website, check out all the different kinds of landmines in the world. They are all, of course, nasty. They all have their specific uses, but that's kind of an overview of landmines used in Ukraine. So maybe just to go through that, and I see it now that the military panel has assembled. Thanks, guys, for joining. Sorry for long overview of landmines, but that was a good request, I think, from listeners from last week. So, hello. So, first of all, I'd like to welcome Havoc 6. Havoc, good afternoon, good evening. Not sure where you are, but thank you for joining Tochnyi today.
Yeah, I really appreciate it. Yeah, it's afternoon here. I'm on the east coast of the U.S., so you're right on the money. I appreciated that breakdown of the landmines, and I thought that was really well put. And for many of us who experienced or saw the effects of EFPs or the explosive force penetrators up front, I think we definitely appreciate just how deadly they are and how dangerous they are. Even in the counterinsurgency environment, they kept many of us up at night, and I'm sure you can relate to that as well as others on the panel.
Yeah, definitely. It is amazing to imagine the kinetic energy that something like that can put into an armored vehicle, even with relatively long standoff ranges, such as 10 meters or so. But yeah, thank you very much for joining us. And then we've got Angry Ants, and hello, Angry Ants. How are you today? Thanks for joining.
Hey, how you doing today? Sorry, I'm gonna ride, so you might hear a little background, but it's always good to see Charles.
Great, thanks. And 122. Good evening, sir.
Good evening. What a great explanation of the mines there, I have to say.
Great, thanks a lot. So we've got Andrew here as well. Good evening or good afternoon, Andrew. Maybe, like we do kind of every week, can you just maybe give us a short overview of any major events that have happened over the front lines in the last couple of days? Is that all right?
Yeah, sure. Well, first, I just want to say that there's a lot of fog of war right now. So But I guess starting in kind of the Bakhmut area, Ukraine is advancing on Bakhmut from every direction. They're moving south from Rozdolivka. I've just been in the past few minutes looking at some satellite imagery from here. It looks like they've moved about a kilometer further south towards Soledar to north of Soledar now. They are moving in on the west of Bakhmut on the northwest. They're moving directly towards Bakhmut. They're now about 300 meters from some of the larger, taller buildings now. So I don't know if 300 meters counts as outskirts anymore. It's kind of like borderline entering Bakhmut at this point. And they might even be in Bakhmut at this. It's hard to tell. There are certainly rumors today. The Ukrainian government came out and said that there's basically like recon and snipers and stuff working in Bakhmut, but nothing more than that. We also see Ukraine moving into Berhivka, which is just north of Bakhmut. There's rumors that they entered the town last night. I'm not sure if that's true or not, but I can tell you that they're definitely within a half kilometer or so of entering the town if they haven't already. The same pretty much goes for Klashivka, which is just south of Bakhmut. So they're really squeezing Bakhmut in every direction. They're having success here. The Russians really don't like talking about the amount of success that Ukraine is having right now, but we're talking about several hundred meters at a time of advance in every direction. I'm not sure what will happen in the near future. I know I know that Russia is moving in reinforcements here to try to stop the Ukrainian advance, and so far they've been able to slow down the advance, especially around Berhivka, but they have not been able to slow it down in around like Klashivka, and also more recently Kurdyamivka, where Ukraine appears to have entered the town. Maybe not have penetrated it deeply, but they're definitely fighting within 100 meters of the town at this point. So the whole Bakhmut area is it's pretty hot. I think you could say this is the current main thrust of the Ukrainian advance, like at the moment, not over the grand scheme of things, but at the moment, kind of the main thrust. Now, around Avdiivka, Ukraine is advancing there as well. They were spotted they're moving maybe 100, 200 meters closer to Krasnohorivka, which is they're maybe now 300 meters away from there. So that they basically cut the distance in half, moving through the gray area there. But they're also moving in every direction out of Avdiivka, north, south, east, west, every direction. So they're expanding outwards. And Russia doesn't appear to be able to stop them. They've been counterattacking, but they haven't been able to push back any of these Ukrainian advances. The same in Pervomaisky, which is right next to Avdiivka. About a week and a half ago, Ukraine advanced several hundred meters closer to Pisky, which is the famous town that Russia spent so many resources capturing. Ukraine is now about 400 meters away from Pisky. Russia is trying to push them back to where they were a few weeks ago, and their attacks have all failed. And I've heard rumors that Ukraine is continuing to attack towards Pisky as well, although there's no evidence of success so far. Now, in the south, there's some evidence that Ukraine is like really close to Pryutny, if not having captured it. Now, this is the town that is southwest from Rivnepil, which they captured a few days ago. Actually, it was probably more likely about a week and a half ago, but they only announced it about 5 days ago. So, anyways, but Pryutny appears that there's fighting. Signs of heavy shelling 360 degrees around the town, which is kind of weird. This is the sort of shelling that I wouldn't expect from Ukrainians. Some of it is like really heavy shelling, more likely aerial bombs, and those bombs appear to be in the southeast of the town, which would be kind of the Russian side of the town, which is kind of weird. Although I guess it could be JDAMs, maybe, who knows. It's hard to tell just from satellite imagery who's shooting who, but there's fighting going on 360 degrees around that town. And there are rumors that as of a few days ago, Ukraine was only one farm field away from the town itself, and who knows if they've advanced since then. It's really hard to tell. Now, getting down to Robotny, Ukraine has pushed within. They're kind of on the final farm fields before entering the town, along a whole stretch of the town, like east to west. They're like one farm field away, all the way across. We're talking. It's a front that's maybe 6 kilometers wide, 7 kilometers, maybe 8, where they're less than a kilometer away from the town along the entire front. There was some rumors today from Russian sources, their propaganda saying that Ukraine had broken through on the western side of this front, and that they had moved several hundred meters. And when we're talking about they're less than a kilometer away, several hundred meters is a big deal. So, but the who knows if you can trust the Russian rumors? And we're gonna have to wait a few days to see objective evidence, most likely. So, but yeah, that's more or less the main front, and then of course there's the fighting going around in Antonivsky Bridge, where Ukraine has a bridgehead on the islands and the Dachi across the Dnipro River from Kherson and Antonivka, where Russia has been trying to fight them away. They fired a Iskander at them, and didn't appear to work very well, and now they're continuing on trying to push Ukraine out of here with their infantry, and their infantry are complaining of high casualties. So it doesn't seem to be working. So yeah, that's kind of around the front.
Yeah, thank you very much, Andrew. And so, gentlemen, what I wanted to do today is just kind of have an open conversation, since we have so much experience and knowledge here. And I just wanted to start off with with a general question, and then we'll see how many topics we get through today. But my first question is, a lot of you have military experience, or technical expertise, or have been very close observers of all of this. Maybe starting with you, Havoc 6, what is your reading of the Ukrainian offensive so far, now that we're basically like a month into it? What are the things that stand out for you?
Honestly, I think the true scope and magnitude of just what they're facing is kind of coming into focus for those who maybe were hoping or suspecting that it would go the same way that Kharkiv did, and unfortunately, that was an unrealistic expectation. If we really tried to shed bias and hope and just took a 10,000-foot view of that layered defense network in the South, we probably would have seen, or should have seen and understood, that this would not be easy. And neither side has air superiority right now, and we've been blessed historically, from just speaking from the U.S. perspective, but also kind of the West in general. We got spoiled by Desert Storm, and we got spoiled by Enduring Freedom in Iraq, because they were both quick, rapid victories against a sizable military. But it wasn't Iraq wasn't a near peer, really. They really weren't. They had sizable AA assets, for instance, but we haven't faced a layered defense network like this, like Ukraine has, ourselves. None of us alive have. And then we've faced defenses, but nothing like this, and not certainly not against a near peer. So I think it is. They made some maybe some small tactical errors at the start, which I think they rapidly changed. I saw something come up today. They were talking about the AMX, the French recon vehicle, and it's not suitable for an assault, or it's not suitable for an offensive move, and that's true. It's a recon vehicle. It shouldn't be at the front of a push. That's not what it's designed for. So I think they're learning. I think what I would take back, what I've observed, and Andrew, you probably would know better than I do, even because I know you're really close to this, but it seems that they have taken a slower approach on purpose, and they've focused now on identifying and letting counter battery exercises take out artillery, EW, and other assets to just further degrade Russian positions in the south. And they're going to keep progressing, but they're going to be a little bit more cautious about it. I do think that they genuinely want to preserve lives of their troops versus their opponent, who doesn't seem to care too much. And I think a slow approach is best for now. And they're doing it responsibly, and it's a tough fight. Frankly, I don't think that they have enough that they should have. They don't have enough engineering vehicles to clear those lanes. They have some for sure, but I just don't think they have the amount that they truly would like. And obviously, again, they don't have air superiority. They struggled to counter the Ka-52s, the alligators, for a bit. Now it sounds like that they did start to counter that a little bit, because again, you change tactics as you go along. But overall, again, I'm seeing good things. I'm glad that they're not just throwing human lives up against a stone wall. That's not smart. That's not the way they should do it. I'm okay personally with their current pace, and slow and steady does sometimes win the race. But at the same time, obviously, if they can exploit any gaps and wrap around some of those defensive networks, they absolutely should. And I think that's what they're looking to do, again, as they further degrade. So overall, from us outside observers, we're not on the front line. We can't say exactly what they're encountering except for what we can see from, again, that 10,000-foot view. But I think they're doing their absolute best with what they have, and I don't think any army on Earth could do any better if they had the exact same set of equipment. That's my opinion.
Thanks a lot, Havoc. And from my perspective, I've been surprised by a couple things during this offensive. One, I was surprised at the locations of where they have made some of their main assaults into that. Everybody knew that there were layered fortifications in Zaporizhia Oblast. So I was surprised at that, and I'm not convinced that that's everywhere it's going to be. But the other thing that I was surprised at was the number of advances that they have made. I wasn't expecting, one big breakthrough or even two main axes of advance, but the number of them, all the way from Bakhmut down to Avdiivka, and then moving all along the southern front. What did you think about that, Havoc?
No, I mean that makes perfect strategic sense. They're forcing Russian forces to make a difficult decision. Do they continue to reinforce the south, which is arguably more strategically important, or do they lose Bakhmut, which they just spent 9-10 months mobilizing every propaganda wing to imply that it was a massive strategic victory? Do they move forces to defend that, or do they keep focused on the south? And that's the right move. Keep them guessing, gain land and territory and strategic land where you can in the meantime, and keep them on their toes. I think Russia has this reputation of being this mastermind of deceit and deception and misinformation, but Ukraine really has them by the balls. Sorry for the rough language, so to speak, but they really keep them on their toes. And I think one of Russia's great weaknesses is its inflexibility. So if they can exploit that, that is excellent. So like Andrew said, making progress on all three sides of the Bakhmut area is excellent. It's going to cause stress in the south no matter what. And hopefully, maybe they'll make some poor strategic decisions that can present an opportunity that, again, Ukraine can exploit elsewhere. So I too was surprised. I did not expect such a quick turnaround in the Bakhmut area at all. I think we all were kind of narrow, tunnel visioned into the south, but it's great. Keep them on their toes. That's all they can do.
Thank you, Andrew. Go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to say, in the past few days, it's been interesting seeing the Russians start to say that attacking Bakhmut was an error made by Wagner. It's interesting for just so many reasons, but it could show us that they might be willing to abandon Bakhmut to defend the south, but while also throwing Wagner under the bus and besmirching their name. So it's just for political reasons, it's interesting, and also for military reasons. But they're starting to really kind of badmouth the capture of Bakhmut in general.
Yeah, thank you, Andrew. I want to go back to that question, kind of your reading of the counteroffensive so far, and maybe I'll put this to 122. So maybe same question. You've been watching this counteroffensive over the last month. We're now 1 month in. Anything that surprises you or stands out to you?
This is going to sound really strange, but not really. I was actually expecting the Russians to put up a fight, unlike a lot of other people. When you were looking at those defensive lines, it's a well-layered defensive line with different scales and layers to it. They have had enough time to prepare, and we do know they use a lot of mines, and mines is a force multiplier that allows you to funnel the enemy into sections where you want them to go, and to cripple them of their mobility, which is the key when you're trying to make a breakthrough or a hasty counteroffensive. So I wasn't too surprised there, actually, how harsh that may sound. What I was kind of surprised is how they went about it as Ukraine, especially the early days where they lost the mine clearing vehicles and all that. I thought it looked a bit, and I have to caveat this. I have no idea what they're thinking or what their plan is, but this is just how it looked. It looked a bit rushed, like unlike what they've done before. It didn't seem well thought out. Or it didn't have enough support actually to suppress the enemy when they were trying to make this push and to get rid of the mines. That's basically it. But I like this, what I'm seeing now. They have the initiative. They're keeping up the pressure. When they do this, they force the enemy to move, and they attrit the enemy and in their defensive fortifications. So the enemy has to move new troops to these fortifications. That means they're abandoning fortifications from elsewhere. So probably they're using troops from fourth line, third line, or how many lines they have, which means eventually those lines are going to lack personnel as well. So when eventually Ukraine breaks one line or two lines, those other lines are not going to be so great anymore, because even though you have a lot of obstacles, you still need personnel in those lines to make them efficient as well. So I like this more thorough, if you may call it that, approach. And it seems like they're trying to attrit the third, fourth line reserves that probably Russia uses. So.
No, that's interesting, and that's excellent. 122. I think when I'm reading commentary on it now from military strategists or operations people, I do hear this. How do I say? Almost kind of this underlying assumption. I'm not going to say hope, but like an underlying assumption that, okay, this phase, the systematic attrition that is happening now, where we've seen the evidence of Russian immediate counterattacks to hold every meter have taken immense casualties in vehicles and personnel, is that at some point there will be either a breaking point, or B, a breakthrough will be easier through subsequent lines because they will not have the soldiers to hold that. I'm not sure. William, do you have any thoughts on that kind of assumption, that this systematic attrition now will naturally lead to a breakthrough or breakdown in Russian forces? I'm not sure if I have William. Maybe there's a Twitter bug. I can't hear him. Can anyone hear him?
It seems to be a speaker on my app, at least. Sorry,
okay.
No, listener. Sorry, listener.
Okay, no worries. Then what I'll do is I'll see if he comes back later. Colby, please go ahead.
Thanks, Charles. Kind of along the lines of what you were just asking, to make an imperfect historical analogy, a lot of people seem to be expecting this offensive to look something like Blitzkrieg or Deep Battle, and I think a better historical comparison might be the Second Battle of Alamein in North Africa, where the British forces were faced with a fairly heavily entrenched German Army Africa that had quite deep minefields, multiple lines of fortification, and they had to approach that methodically and chose sort of a set piece battle, attritional approach rather than just attempting one decisive breakthrough. And ultimately, that strategy paid off. So I think that the Ukrainians are taking a bit of a similar approach right now, where they're attempting to attrit the Russians on numerous lines of advance and testing to see where they can find the weakest point in the line, rather than just picking one spot or two spots on the map and then focusing all efforts on those two locations in the hope of achieving a decisive breakthrough. So there may not be a lot of territorial gains right now that we can see because of that strategy, but I think it's probably in the long run the better strategy for them to take this slowly but surely, especially since they definitely don't have the advantage in material that they would like. The number of vehicles and munitions that are coming in from NATO is still not at the level that you would want. So I think the sort of slow and cautious approach here is probably better.
Great, thanks, Colby. 122, please.
And if I'm not mistaken, the US had like similar difficulties during or after D-Day. They didn't move very much once they, made a bridgehead, and they had to fight for quite a while until they got treated the Germans enough in that area so they could eventually move forward. And I think it's a pretty good analogy. We might be seeing they're trying to, establish small bridgeheads, for example, what's called the Rivnopol area there, or Kyiv. Sorry, my brain is not working, etc. So they're making small wedges and, provoking the Russians to try and to move in on them with their counterattacks, and then making them vulnerable to what the Ukrainians are really good at, and defending and exploiting the Russian weakness. So I think that we will hopefully eventually see happen is they will run out of people or equipment to stop the push when they're trying to go forward.
Interesting, 122. Maybe, Havoc, you were officer, U.S. Army, and I believe you were also an officer in Afghanistan. Is that right?
Yep, I was Afghanistan, Iraq, and Syria. Okay.
Great. So that my question for you then is, when we're looking at the type of operations, this methodical breaching and attrition that we've seen, since, well, for the last 3 weeks. After the first week, obviously they went out a bit more systematically. Is this just what we should be expecting when there's no air superiority? From a Western viewpoint, are we just too presumptive of air superiority, and this is just the way it looks?
That's my opinion. Again, like I said earlier, I think we have been spoiled because the U.S. military has typically put a lot of emphasis in our air forces, which is correct. I think that's 100% correct, and we obviously practice a doctrine of combined arms operations. The what was the other air-land battle from, I think that ended in the 80s, was a really interesting doctrine that talked about the synchronizing of all the above. So our perspective again is it's just ingrained in that. We haven't experienced anything quite like this. So I'm not saying they could obviously exploit a gap tomorrow that opens up and the entire situation changes. If for some reason there's some kind of significant breakthrough, which can happen any day, and they do happen to envelop these layered defenses from behind or from the flanks, that it's a completely different situation. But from my perspective, this is what it looks like when you don't have everything you need. And our drip feed method of providing arms and ammo, this is what it looks like without providing an absolute overwhelming majority of equipment. They don't have overmatch, and again, this might be something I'm wrong on, but as far as I know, there was a slight artillery overmatch at one point in Ukraine's favor in the south, but I'm not sure if that's true anymore. As far as I know, they don't truly overmatch them in really any capacity. They're pretty equal. Please don't quote me on that because I'm not as deep in the woods, but again, from that viewpoint, I think this is what we should expect. And breakthroughs will happen likely, and they can happen, but it is going to be a slow go. All we can hope for is that the attrition is kept to a minimal while the exploitation of Russian weaknesses are increased, and we get them more of what they need to exploit those lines.
Thanks, Havoc. And I want to pick up on that topic and bring in John, the drip feed of aid, not just in volume, but also in type. Of course, the latest reports from Washington, I think the Wall Street Journal was the first one to mention it, is that the U.S. is very close to changing its policy on DPICM munitions and also on ATACMS. John, anything to add?
Right. So regarding DPICM, dual purpose improved cluster munitions, for those who are unfamiliar, they are a type of cluster munition delivered either via tubed artillery in the form of a cargo shell that disperses several dozen high explosive anti-tank submunitions that create both anti-vehicle and anti-personnel effects. There's also a specific version, the M26 MLRS, that was originally designed for BM-270, as well as subsequently HIMARS. The U.S. has consistently refused to transfer these munitions to Ukraine. The Ukrainian government has been requesting them, I believe, quite literally since week one of the invasion. What is particularly notable about them is that compared to conventional unitary high explosive projectiles, be it 155 millimeter, 105, etc., they have, statistically speaking, they achieve much more significant effects on target, just on a one-to-one basis. I believe the statistics from Vietnam are something on the order of a single DPICM shell a single 155 millimeter DPICM shell could replicate the effects of just standard HE at a ratio of about 30 to 1. So one DPICM shell to create the effects of 30 HE shells. The difference in effectiveness against particularly massed personnel, massed vehicles, is quite substantial. In terms of U.S. policy regarding them, historically, for the better part of, I think, more than 15 years now, there has been a provision attached to every NDAA, National Defense Authorization Act, which provides most of the annual funding for the Department of Defense. There has been a line item attached in every single one of those acts now for, again, I think 15 plus years now, that prohibits the U.S. government from transferring cluster munitions, selling cluster munitions, or transferring the technology to manufacture them to third-party countries if those cluster munitions, or their associated submunitions specifically, have a dud rate of greater than 1%, out of concern for the UXOs that cluster munitions are notorious for creating, and specifically their hazards to the civilian population in a post-conflict environment. There is a process through which the White House can waive that restriction. They have, up until seemingly the present, declined not to do so, at least not publicly. We have, based upon the reporting from Wall Street Journal and a couple other outlets, it seems that they have begun to rethink their position on this. I suspect that this action to perhaps the offensive maybe not proceeding as close to the originally planned timetable, as both the Ukrainian Armed Forces and the U.S. Department of Defense would have hoped. I would say that, broadly speaking, that would fit into a larger pattern that we've seen of potentially the White House and the Department of Defense having, I would argue, a somewhat myopic view and focusing perhaps overly much on immediate battlefield needs as opposed to having a little bit more focus on medium to longer term needs, because they needed this DPICM literally, a year plus ago. It would have been just as useful then as it is now. So that very much seems to me to indicate that this is a reaction to recent events. The situation with ATACMS is a little bit more nebulous than with DPICM, but I would also imagine if there's any change to U.S. policy there, it's likely precipitated by current events related to the offensive. I suspect that there is, in both cases, a political element involved, because Turkey has been transferring 155 millimeter DPICM shells and 4 A3 Alpha 1s, I believe, for at least the past 6 months. I believe foreign policy, or no, one of the foreign affairs media outlets reported that they were transferring them as of January of this year. Those are U.S. cluster munitions technology. We exported them to them several decades ago, along with the technology to manufacture them. They need a license from the State Department to transfer them to Ukraine. So either we secretly gave them that license and didn't tell anybody, or we know about it and we're intentionally turning a blind eye to them violating their end user agreement with us. So we are clearly very cognizant of Ukraine's need for these munitions, but up until recently, it seems that for whatever political reason, the White House and Department of Defense has elected not to directly endorse transfers.
Thank you very much for that information, John. And that brings me kind of to my last question for our military panel today, which again is sort of a general question. Is since this war began a year and a half ago, and it became really a social media war, I noticed, of course, large groups of the population suddenly become very interested in the minutia of warfare, of operations, of procurement, of technology, and even of combat. In my case, I mean, one of the things that I found most interesting is explaining to people cluster munitions, UXO, mines, and then other things regarding explosive hazards and so on. But maybe from your guys' side, what are some things that you see are very interesting when dealing with the public, learning about warfighting, procurement, technology, tactics, combat? What are things that are interesting for you? Havoc 6, you want to start?
Yeah, sure. Can you do me a favor? It broke up a little bit for me at the end there. Could you just repeat the question? I'm sorry.
Sure. So now that you have lots of people around the world very interested in the details of warfighting, procurement, military technology, tactics, combat, and so on, what do you find most interesting about sort of public perceptions and their learning about modern warfare?
Yeah, that is actually an interesting question. I think for me, for me personally, when we were overseas doing these conflicts, these low intensity conflicts in the Middle East and whatnot, it was easy for a lot of folks back home to kind of ignore it and forget about it because, again, they were low intensity. It didn't really impact public life. And you could argue still today that Ukraine doesn't necessarily impact the day to day, let's say, again, from my perspective of the average American. You can go your whole day without thinking a thought about it, and it's really not going to impact you unless you're heavily involved in politics and that riles you up. But I do notice that I have had a lot of people reach out to me that are looking for information and perspective, and some of them are very afraid for a long time. Like, hey, is this gonna escalate? And escalation in a way, and not like in that scary word where people are using that as an excuse to drop all aid. Not like that, but just genuinely thinking like, hey, are you gonna get called up and have to be sent to Poland or wherever else? And that was a little bit different, from the perspective. And a lot of my personal, friends, colleagues, and people I've worked with in the past have gotten very involved and interested in learning more about NATO as an organization and Ukraine as well. Where I live here in the U.S., there's a very, very big Ukrainian population, and there's been a lot of interest in events that kicked off around here to learn more about the culture and the people, and learn from people who are experiencing this even from afar, who have families involved. So, besides that, a lot of lessons are being learned, for better or for worse, which I've kind of talked about previously in other chats. And I think that's going to be, for me, that's going to be one of the most interesting takeaways from all this is, what are we going to learn from this scenario, and how can we bring in the Ukrainian military into these conversations in the future so we can properly learn from them? Because right now they are the most experienced army in the world as far as near peer conflict goes. That's just the reality. So I'm eager to learn a lot from them, and I hope that we take the right lessons away and we apply them properly.
Thank you. I completely agree. Colby, please.
I continue to be both surprised and very encouraged by the fact that there are so many people that are interested in coming onto spaces like this and others and learning about the war and specifically learning about sort of the more the military aspects. And we get pretty technical sometimes in these discussions, and it's really interesting that people actually really enjoy hearing that level of detail, because they certainly don't usually get that from legacy media sources. But because most people are sort of new to this format and new to Ukraine and new to learning about this sort of stuff, we have a lot of work to do in sort of educating people about the reality of war and foreign policy and national security issues, because their current views are very heavily shaped by the information or lack thereof that they have received from legacy media sources, and especially Hollywood as well. A lot of people's understanding of war is very, it's not very accurate because they've sort of just, they've learned from Hollywood, from pop culture, that's just sort of shaped their lack of understanding about these topics. So we do have a lot of work cut out for us in trying to get people to understand the reality of how things actually work.
Thanks a lot, Colby. Yeah, it's amazing how many things I've had to discuss regarding Hollywood, especially with the Enemy at the Gates, for example. My goodness, don't get me started on that one. 122, from your side, enhanced public interest in, what is combat, warfighting, military training, technology. What do you find interesting about helping people understand this?
The general interest, of course, going up. But one of the things which I see and which sometimes, annoys me a bit is that how much people underestimate the importance of logistics. And the fact that when you say you have X amount of soldiers available, everyone thinks, oh, that's a soldier with a gun that's going to be fighting at the front line. But it's actually a lot of people making it possible for other people to fight at the front line. So that's one of the things I get into discussions with people and having to try and explain that in order for me to drive my tank to a position and for my gunner to fire, there's a whole chain of people behind everything that makes it possible. Everything from getting it out of a production facility to the front line and all the steps on the way there, different transports, methods, you name it, food, ammo, kit, all kind of, shoes, whatever. All those things that you need to explain to people how important they are. People think that the guns, yeah, they're important. They're really vital. But there's so many other things. They're so important for the army to function and for you to be able to defeat your enemy in battle. And that's one of the things I keep struggling with, how people do not understand this or even have, a slight idea of how important it is. And I hope it gets a lot more credit, or the logistics people get a lot more credit and understanding from the general public, because they do a huge job allowing the other guys to get on the front line and do their job. So, yeah.
Thank you very much, 122. And I'll go to you, John, for this question as well. In your tracking of military technology, development, procurement, and all of this, there's a huge interest in all of these weapon systems and what they do and how they work. What has surprised you, or what is a common misconception you encounter?
I think that people often get hung up. I mean, this was a learning experience very much for myself as well, towards the beginning of the invasion and the wider war, is you can't really look just at, statistics, figures on paper, in the sense of, and 122 was speaking to an aspect of this as well, of a particular system, of a particular collection of systems, or the particular, assets or theoretical capabilities of, or element of an armed forces, or that armed forces as a whole. There's just so much under the hood, I guess, integration aspects related to integration and interaction of systems within systems, between individuals, groups of individuals that really, I guess, make or break all of these assets, this equipment, these systems, this technology. I think I guess a good microcosm of this is that you can't just, for example, look at, what are the capabilities of this particular main battle tank or infantry fighting vehicle on paper compared to whatever your adversary is using. You have to actually consider that real world picture of how is it integrated with other systems, with supporting capabilities. How is the enemy likewise perform that integration, that interaction? How is it sustained? What is its readiness, etc.? There's these very human, very real world factors that get ignored if you just take, I guess, a surface level view of things.
Yeah, thank you very much. Colby, please go ahead.
Just to piggyback off of John's point very quickly, and I've said this before, a well-trained tank crew is much more valuable than a capable tank, and that goes really for any vehicle, but especially for tanks. It doesn't matter what the paper capabilities of the tank is. If the crew doesn't know what they're doing, it's not going to be an effective vehicle.
Yeah, definitely. War is more than data sheets and statistics, and it's also not a purely human endeavor either. It's the integration of all of this together. So we've gone a little bit over time, but thank you all guys very much for joining us for today. Havoc, John, 122, Colby, Andrew, fantastic. I'd also like to thank Exit 266. I believe she's already had to leave due to her next appointment. But again, thank you guys very much, and hope to talk to you again soon on this space, maybe next week or in a few weeks. And with that, I'll hand it back over to Joseph. I believe it's back to you.
Thank you, Charles. Thank you, everyone, for listening to Tochnyi Weekly. We do broadcast live at 1800 UTC every week. A recording of this episode and all our content is available on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and many other podcast platforms. Please do also subscribe to Tochnyi's new Substack for written content and research. We also recommend Andrew's weekly stream for information from the front lines, which broadcasts midnight UTC every Wednesday. That's 8 p.m. Tuesday, New York time. Our guest Havoc 6 also has a new podcast and blog, Hotel Havoc. Havoc, could you tell our listeners more about your podcast and where to find it?
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. So it's kind of a broad category. I mean, obviously I lean more towards the defense and military aspect, but yeah, I just try to get some insight from people that have different backgrounds and are subject matter experts in various topics, and we have a very casual chat as if we're just sharing a beer at a campfire type thing. It's very low entry, so to speak, and yeah, again, really casual, but it's on my link tree in my profile if you're interested, and I'd be happy to have any of you on sometime to chat as well. So please reach out to me if you're interested.
Wonderful. Thanks so much. And thanks to all our guests like Havoc for coming, and thanks to our panel. Thanks to all our listeners for tuning in. And also, I wanted to mention to our live audience, Michael Bond has a space that comes on right now that is also covers very similar information and topics. So if you're interested, please do check that out. And so thanks everyone again for tuning in, and Slava Ukraini.
Heroin Slava.
Slava.
On behalf of the brave.